I told you she's not stealing the spotlight today. The voice slid through the half-open door like a cold draft. Carla, my daughter-in-law. Her tone was low, but it carried that razor-thin edge she never bothered to hide from me. She'll understand, Lucas said. My grandson's voice, steady, almost resigned, landed heavier than her malice. He believed it. He believed I would understand. I reached for my glasses on the nightstand. My fingers brushed bare wood. I patted wider, knocking over the glass of water I'd set out last night. The splash soaked into the carpet with a sound that felt far too loud for the early morning. Blinking, I tried to focus, but the world was a smear of light and shadow. The scent of burnt coffee from the lobby drifted up, mingled with the faint chemical tang of cleaning spray. I swung my legs over the bed and my toes caught on something soft. My gown. The plum-colored silk I'd sewn for 3 months, one careful stitch after another, lay in a heap. A jagged tear split the bodice from neckline to waist, ripped not cut. The threads frayed like tiny screams frozen in place. For a second, my mind went back to the fitting in front of the mirror, Louise circling me with pins in her mouth, saying, "Lucas won't take his eyes off you when he walks that stage." That moment had felt warm. Now it was ash. I bent down, the cold floor pressing into my knees, and gathered the ruined fabric into my lap. It was still warm from the radiator's dry air. My hands smoothed the silk by habit, as if my touch could undo what had been done. But the damage was deliberate. Someone wanted me small, hidden, forgettable. My scalp prickled as I caught sight of my reflection in the dresser mirror. Blurry without my glasses, yet clear enough to see the slump in my shoulders. I straightened instinctively. If they wanted me to look broken, they wouldn't get that satisfaction. The voices outside grew faint, then the click of a door told me they'd gone. I sat on the bed's edge, tracing the torn seam with my thumb. Each pull of thread felt like a tally of the times I'd been eased out of photos, seated at the far end of the table, left off the guest list entirely. At first, I'd told myself it was oversight. Now I knew better. I stood opening the closet where my suitcase sat half-zipped. Inside, tucked between layers of tissue paper, was the backup, an indigo velvet dress I'd bought years ago at a thrift store. It wasn't the gown I'd dreamed of wearing, but it carried a different kind of history. It had been mine long before Carla ever walked into this family. My fingers brushed the cool surface of the envelope hidden in my carry-on side pocket. Inside was a cashier's check, full tuition for Lucas's first year at the university he'd fought to get into. I'd been saving it for this moment, for the pride of handing it to him in front of everyone. And now the urge to do it was sharper than ever. Not in spite of this morning's sabotage, but because of it. The room was too quiet. I could hear my own breath steadying. I slipped into the velvet dress, the fabric heavier but stronger under my hands. Without my glasses, I'd have to navigate the blur, but I'd done harder things. I pinned my hair back, added the small pearl earrings James gave me on our 40th anniversary, and stood tall. In the hallway, the patterned carpet muted my steps. Every scent, hotel soap, brewed coffee, someone's too strong cologne, felt amplified, as if the world had decided I should remember exactly how this morning smelled. I pushed through the lobby doors and into the brisk air, my lungs filling with the clean bite of late spring. By the time I reached the auditorium, the chatter of families and the shuffle of programs in hands became a wall of sound. I found my seat, third row from the stage, directly across from where Carla sat with Lucas's mother-in-law. Her eyes landed on me. No flicker of surprise, just a slow, measuring look. When Lucas's name was called, he stepped forward, tall in his cap and gown, scanning the crowd. For a moment his gaze caught mine. I saw the hesitation, the memory of this morning's choice, flicker across his face. When the special awards were announced, I rose, the envelope in my hand. The stage lights were warm on my skin as I walked to the podium. The murmur in the crowd dipped into silence. "Lucas?" I said, my voice carrying into every corner of the hall. "You've always been the brightest part of my story. And no matter who tries to write me out of it, I will always be here." I placed the envelope in his hands. His fingers closed around it slowly, his eyes darting to Carla, then back to me. There was no hiding the flush on his cheeks. The applause began as a ripple and grew into a swell. Carla's smile faltered, the kind of crack you can't repair in public. I stepped back, letting the sound wash over us. My heart beat steady. They had tried to make me vanish. Instead, they'd made sure everyone was looking right at me. The applause from the auditorium still echoed in my ears long after I stepped outside. The spring air felt heavier now, as if it had picked up the weight I'd been carrying all morning. I gripped the railing, letting the metal's chill seep into my palm, trying to slow my heartbeat. Lucas had hugged me before he left the stage. It was brief, polite enough for the audience, but the warmth in it wasn't pretend. Still, there'd been a hesitation, a question behind his eyes that I couldn't read fully. Or maybe I already knew, and just didn't want to face it. As I walked toward the parking lot, my mind drifted backward, uninvited, to a different spring morning 12 years ago. Lucas had been 6, all elbows and cowlicks, waiting on the porch with his backpack that looked twice his size. His mother was gone, off chasing something shinier than the life she had, and Lucas had been quiet for weeks. That day, I'd made pancakes in the shape of dinosaurs. He'd smiled when he saw them, the first real smile in months. "Do you think I can be a paleontologist?" he'd ask, mouth full of stegosaurus tail. I told him he could be anything, and I meant it. I'd meant it when I sat through every school concert, every late-night science project, every awkward middle school phase when he thought deodorant was optional. Back then, it never occurred to me that love could be rewritten, that someone could come in and edit the story until my role was smaller, quieter, almost invisible. But that's what Carla had done. Slowly, with a kind of precision you don't notice until the final cut is already made. I reached my car, the velvet dress bunching slightly as I slid into the driver's seat. The envelope was no longer in my hand. Lucas had tucked it under his arm like a football, as if holding onto it could keep it safe. I hoped it would. It wasn't just money. It was years of craft fairs, hours spent bending over needle and thread until my fingers ached, selling each piece with the thought, "This will help him get further than I ever could." Through the windshield, I could see families spilling out of the auditorium. Mothers adjusting ties, fathers clapping sons on the back, grandparents snapping photos with shaky hands. I didn't pull away right away. Instead, I sat there, letting the scene blur slightly without my glasses, feeling the old ache of being on the outside looking in. It wasn't the distance itself that hurt most. It was knowing that once, not too long ago, Lucas would have left the crowd to find me first. And now, I had to decide if I could stand by quietly and let that gap grow wider, or if it was time to remind everyone exactly where I belonged. I didn't have to wonder long about Carla's next move. The passenger door of a dark blue SUV swung open 2 rows over. She stepped out, heels clicking against the asphalt, her dress the exact shade of smug. On her arm, Lucas's future mother-in-law, perfect hair, perfect posture, perfect poison in a smile. They didn't see me right away. Carla leaned in close to the other woman, speaking low, one manicured hand gesturing toward the auditorium doors. The mother-in-law's lips curved, but it wasn't a friendly shape. I slid my glasses on, the scene sharpening like a cruel photograph. Carla's eyes flicked toward Lucas as he emerged, the envelope still under his arm. I saw the way she reached for it, fingers light but intent, her face composed as if she were simply helping him carry things. He hesitated. It was small, a pause, a fraction of a second, but enough to send a thread of relief through me. Then he shifted the envelope to his other side, out of her reach. Her smile thinned. It was the kind of moment you could miss if you weren't looking for it. I was looking. I stayed in my car, watching through the windshield as the group began to move toward the parking lot exit. Carla said something I couldn't hear, and Lucas's expression changed, brows knitting, mouth pressing into a thin line. He glanced over his shoulder, scanning the lot until his gaze landed on me. For a moment, we just looked at each other. I didn't wave. I didn't smile. I just held his gaze, steady as if to say, "Think for yourself, not for them." Then Carla touched his arm, light as silk, and turned him away. The group disappeared around the corner, swallowed by the crowd. The hum of the engine under my hands was the only sound. I could have driven home then, gone back to my quiet house and pretended this morning was just an unfortunate start to an otherwise decent day. But the gown in my back seat was still ripped. The insult was still fresh. And Carla was still working, thread by thread, to unpick me from Lucas's life. I thought about the years ahead, graduations, weddings, birthdays, and how easy it would be to lose my place entirely if I let her keep stitching the narrative. The idea made my chest tighten. I put the car in gear, pulling out slowly, merging into the flow of traffic leaving the school. I didn't know exactly what I would do yet, but I knew I wasn't finished. Today had given me a glimpse of the game she was playing, and the next time we met on that board, I intended to make my move first. 2 days later, the air in my kitchen felt different. Too still, too staged. The tulips Carla had sent sat on the counter, already drooping at the edges, their petals sagging like they'd heard bad news. I just set a kettle on the stove when the knock came, sharp, impatient. Through the lace curtain, I saw her standing there, hair perfect, phone in hand, like she'd been timing my reaction. I opened the door halfway. "Carla," I said, keeping my voice even. She didn't waste time. "I thought we should talk about Saturday," she began, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Her perfume followed her, all citrus and something expensive coating the air. "Is that what we're calling it?" I asked. Her smile was small, deliberate. "You made quite the scene. People were confused. Some even thought you were trying to make it about you." The words were silk over steel, but I felt each barb. I moved to the counter, pouring water over the tea leaves, the steam curling between us. "Lucas didn't seem confused," I said. She tilted her head. "Lucas is young, impressionable. I don't want him feeling obligated." She let the word linger, heavy with implication. I turned, meeting her eyes. "Obligated? To thank me, to accept help, to carry you," she said, the tone tightening. "It's not fair to put that weight on him. You've had your time, Martha. Now it's about what's best for his future." The kettle's whistle faded, but the ringing in my ears didn't. For a second, all I could hear was the scrape of a chair on linoleum from years ago, James pushing back from the table, saying something about sacrifice, and "you'll understand someday." I'd understood too well. Carla set her phone on the counter, tapping it once like a gavel. "I've been looking at assisted living communities," she said, almost casually. "Lovely places, safe. No more worrying about bills or maintenance." I let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. She shifted, her confidence cracking just a fraction. "Do you know why I made that gown?" I asked finally. She blinked, caught off guard. "For the graduation?" "For myself," I said. "To remind me I'm still here. And Saturday proved something, Carla. You want me gone not because I'm in the way, but because I remind you you're not in control." Her lips tightened, and for a heartbeat, I saw the truth in her eyes, an awareness that I wasn't going to play the role she'd written for me. She picked up her phone, sliding it back into her bag. "I'm just trying to make things easier," she said, the softness returning to her tone. It was the kind of softness that bruises when you press on it. At the door, she paused. "Think about what I said. We'll talk again." When she left, the kitchen felt even smaller. But the weight in my chest wasn't defeat. It was resolve taking shape. If Carla wanted a game, she'd just given me my opening move. The click of the front door echoed through the house long after Carla's SUV pulled away. I stayed at the kitchen counter, both hands wrapped around the mug of tea I hadn't touched. The steam had faded, leaving it lukewarm, but I wasn't ready to move. My eyes drifted to the tulips on the counter. They'd gone from bright to limp in just 2 days, stems bending under their own weight. I thought about throwing them out, but instead, I moved them to the center of the table. Let them wilt where they could be seen. It wasn't just Saturday's gown or today's conversation. Carla's campaign had been a long, slow erosion, polite suggestions about how I might rest. During family events, forgotten invitations, the quiet swapping of my seat at holiday dinners to the far end. Each cut so small you could almost pretend it wasn't there, until the fabric finally tore. I rinsed the tea leaves down the sink and set the empty mug in the drainer. The kitchen clock ticked softly, a sound that always reminded me of late nights sewing under the yellow glow of the desk lamp. Back then, I'd stitched not just fabric, but my place in this family. Hemming, mending, creating things meant to last. And maybe it was time to start stitching again, only differently. In the hall closet, beneath an old quilt, sat a narrow lockbox. I carried it to the table, the metal cool against my palms. Inside, my savings ledger lay exactly where I'd left it, neat rows of numbers inked in my own handwriting. Every entry told a story: craft fair earnings, the check from selling James's old truck, small windfalls I'd tucked away instead of spending. Carla probably thought I had just enough to scrape by. She didn't know about the ledger. She didn't know I'd planned for decades, not just for myself but for moments like Saturday, moments where quiet resources could change the game. I closed the lockbox and slid it back under the quilt. Not yet. The timing had to be right. Stepping out onto the porch, I breathed in the crisp afternoon air. A dog barked 2 streets over. Somewhere nearby, someone was frying bacon, the smell mingling with the faint tang of early spring soil. It grounded me in a way Carla's perfume never could. I took a slow walk down the sidewalk, nodding at Mrs. Keegan across the street, who was tending her rose bushes. We chatted about the weather, her voice warm, her eyes curious but not prying. The kind of small interaction that reminded me not every connection in my life was under Carla's control. By the time I reached my porch again, the resolve I'd felt in the kitchen had sharpened. Carla wanted to move pieces quietly, behind closed doors, until I was out of the picture. Fine, I could move quietly too. The only difference was, when I made my move, she wouldn't see it coming until it was already in place. The call came on a Wednesday afternoon, just as I was finishing the hem on a customer's table runner. Lucas's name lit up my phone, but when I answered, it was Carla's voice. "Martha, we're meeting with the notary tomorrow at 11. Just a quick signature for some property paperwork." "Nothing complicated," she said, breezy as a morning radio host. "What property paperwork?" I asked. A pause, short but telling. "It's about simplifying things. You've got assets in your name that could be streamlined. Less hassle for you in the long run." I felt the prickle at the back of my neck. Carla had a way of dressing her words in silk while hiding the barbs underneath. "Send me the documents first," I said. "Oh, it's all very standard. I'll bring them by tonight so you can skim them over. No need to overthink it." The line went dead before I could say more. That evening, she arrived with a manila envelope tucked under her arm, handing it to me like a takeout order. I set it on the kitchen table, the weight of it heavier than paper should be. Carla stayed standing, eyes darting toward the envelope as though willing me to open it right then. I didn't. Instead, I asked if she'd like tea. She declined, tapping her watch, saying she had other errands. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving the faint trace of her perfume in the hall. I waited until I heard her SUV drive away before opening the envelope. Inside was a stack of legal forms, dense with fine print. The first page labeled it a transfer of ownership agreement. My name was printed neatly on the grantor. Line Carla's was absent, replaced with the name of a limited liability company I'd never heard of. The second page made my stomach drop. Listed under assets was my savings account number, not the joint account for household expenses. My personal account, the one tied to that ledger in the lockbox. The number beside it wasn't the balance I'd last seen. It was smaller, much smaller. I read it again, thinking my eyes were playing tricks, but the figures stayed the same. There was no line item explaining the difference, no mention of where the missing money had gone. A memory flashed. Last month, Lucas stopping by to fix a leaky faucet, Carla trailing behind him with a folder. I'd been in the garden when she asked for the weak Fi password. I'd handed her my tablet without thinking. Now, the idea that she might have had enough time to see my online banking app made my skin crawl. The clock on the wall ticked past 9. I closed the envelope, pressing the clasp shut, and carried it to my bedroom. Slipping it under the mattress felt symbolic, hiding something in plain sight until I decided my next move. That night I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The numbers from that page burned into my mind. If money was already gone, signing anything tomorrow would only make it worse. But if I refused, Carla would know I was onto her. Either way, tomorrow wasn't going to be a quick signature. It was going to be a test of how much she thought I'd swallow and how much I was willing to fight back. The notary's office was smaller than I'd expected. Just a cramped room above a strip mall, smelling faintly of toner and stale coffee. Carla was already there, perched in a chair across from a desk piled with manila folders. She stood when I walked in, her smile fixed but her eyes scanning me for cracks. "Martha," she said brightly, as if we were meeting for lunch. "Ready to get this done?" I took my time hanging my coat on the back of the chair. I'd like to go over the documents again before I sign anything. Her smile didn't falter, but her jaw tightened. "Of course, but the notary has other appointments, so let's be efficient." "The notary?" A thin man with glasses slipping down his nose, slid the papers toward me. "These are the same ones you received last night," he said, his voice flat, rehearsed. I flipped through the stack, the paper whispering against my fingertips. Everything looked identical to what I'd read at my kitchen table, right down to the asset list with my account number. "Before we start," I said, "I noticed the balance on this account is different from my records. Can you explain that?" Carla leaned forward, her tone light. "Oh, that's just because of a routine transfer. Nothing to worry about." "To where?" I asked. She hesitated, just for a blink, before recovering. "To a temporary holding account. We consolidated a few things for tax efficiency," I met her eyes. Without my consent. The notary cleared his throat, shifting in his seat. Mom, if you're not comfortable. I'm not, I said, cutting him off. Carla's smile thinned into a line. Martha, this is about making life easier for everyone. Less paperwork for you, more security for Lucas's future. Funny, I said. I thought security meant keeping what's yours safe, not giving it away to an LLC I've never heard of. Her eyes flashed. Just for a second, but the mask slid back into place. Do you really want to make this harder than it needs to be? I set the pen down deliberately, its tip clicking against the desk. Yes. The notary looked between us, clearly uncomfortable. Well, in that case, I can't proceed until both parties are fully in agreement. Carla exhaled sharply, gathering the papers in a neat stack. Fine. We'll reschedule once you've had more time to think. As she stood, I noticed her nails, perfectly polished, but one thumbnail chipped at the corner. A tiny imperfection, hidden unless you were close enough to see. Outside, the cold air hit me like a truth I'd known but hadn't wanted to face. She'd already taken steps behind my back. The meeting wasn't about permission, it was about formality, tidying up loose ends after the fact. Carla walked ahead to her SUV, phone pressed to her ear. I slowed my pace, letting the distance grow between us until I could barely hear her voice. When I reached my car, I didn't start the engine right away. I sat with my hands on the wheel, thinking about that chipped nail. It wasn't much, but it was proof that she wasn't untouchable, that if I got close enough, I could find the weak spots. And when I did, I wouldn't waste my time just pointing them out. I'd pull until the whole thing unraveled. The first sign was the group text. It used to be that family plans, dinners, birthdays, even errands, buzzed my phone with little pings from Lucas, sometimes from Carla, occasionally from my daughter herself. Now the thread was silent on my end. When I finally checked, I saw a new group name, Family Hub. I wasn't in it. Instead, I got a polite message from Carla. Hi, Martha. We'll be busy most weekends this month. Let's touch base later. Most weekends meant all weekends, and touch base meant don't call us. The second sign came the following Saturday, when I saw them loading picnic baskets into the back of the SUV. From my front window, I watched Lucas slip a blanket inside, his smile easy, while Carla directed him with one hand and balanced a tray of drinks with the other. I stepped onto the porch, waving. Where are you off to? Carla glanced up, the corners of her mouth lifting in a quick, polite smile. Oh, just a little park outing with some friends. I looked at Lucas. Couldn't use one more. His eyes darted toward Carla before he shrugged. It's kind of a couple's thing, Grandma. The word, Grandma, felt heavier than it should have, like a reminder of my designated place. I nodded, pretending it was fine, and watched them drive away. Inside, the house was too quiet. The ticking clock in the hallway seemed louder, each second stretching. I made tea, but it tasted flat. Even the tulips on the table, now brittle and curling, looked tired of waiting for company. By afternoon, the ache in my chest had settled into something sharper. I needed air, so I walked to the small downtown market. Stalls of fresh bread, honey jars, and hand-woven scarves lined the sidewalks. People milled about chatting with neighbors, their laughter carrying on the crisp breeze. That's where I spotted Lucas. He was by the coffee cart, holding 2 cups, scanning the crowd. When he saw me, his smile widened just a little, genuine in a way that warmed something in me. Grandma, he said, handing me one of the cups. It's just black? How you like it? I took it surprised. You didn't have to. I wanted to, he said quickly. He glanced over his shoulder, and I followed his gaze to see Carla across the street, deep in conversation with another woman, her back to us. For a moment, it was just the two of us. Lucas lowered his voice. I've been meaning to stop by. I know things have been weird. Weird. That was one word for it? Don't worry about me, I said. You just keep doing what you need to do. But he shook his head slightly, as if to say it wasn't that simple. Then Carla turned, spotting him. He stepped back, pressing the warm cup into my hands. I'll call you, he said, already moving toward her. I stood there for a while after they left, the market noise fading into the background. The coffee was still hot, but I sipped it slowly, as if stretching the moment out might make it last longer. It didn't. By the time I walked home, the ache had returned. But beneath it was something else, small, stubborn, and steady, because even a brief kindness in the middle of isolation could be enough to keep you standing. And I wasn't planning on sitting down anytime soon. The next weekend, The sound of laughter reached me before I even opened the front door. It drifted from 2 houses down. My daughter's backyard? I stepped onto the porch, my sweater pulled tight, and caught sight of strings of paper lanterns swaying over their fence. Music played low but cheerful. The kind of music that used to float through my own yard during birthdays and barbecues. Cars lined the street. I recognized some from Lucas's friends, a few from neighbors I'd shared potato salad recipes with years ago. There was no note in my mailbox, no text on my phone, nothing but the invitation I didn't receive. From my porch, I could see movement in the backyard through a gap in the fence boards. Carla in a sundress, head thrown back in a practiced laugh. My daughter standing beside her, plates in hand. Lucas helping at the grill, his face lit by the orange flare as he flipped something over. I went inside, closing the door on the sound. The silence was worse. I busied myself in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for a stew I didn't need, just to keep my hands moving. The knife thunked softly against the cutting board, each slice steady, measured. If they thought pushing me to the edges would make me fade, they didn't understand what I'd learned from years of holding a household together. Quiet work often outlasts loud shows. After the stew was simmering, I went to the hall closet and pulled out the lockbox again. I set it on the table, flipping through the ledger. Every figure was still there, every deposit I'd made. The missing money from that account still gnawed at me, but tonight the numbers were a reminder I still had resources. I still had choices. I took out a notepad and started a list, names of old friends. People Carla wouldn't think to call. Louise from high school, who owned the vintage shop. Mrs. Keegan across the street, who knew everyone's comings and goings without seeming nosy. 2 former co-workers from the library, both with sharp minds for details and a willingness to keep a secret. The lantern light flickered against my wall as the wind shifted, carrying another burst of laughter from outside. I let it wash over me without flinching. I remembered other nights, long before Carla, when James and I hosted dinners that stretched late into the evening. Our table was never about status or control. It was about connection, and maybe that was why her version of family felt so hollow to me. It was curated, managed, edited. I'd lived enough years to know the difference. By the time the music died down, my list was complete. I tore the page from the pad, folded it twice, and tucked it into the ledger. It wasn't a plan yet, but it was a map, and a map meant there was somewhere to go. The stew was ready. I ladled a bowl for myself, the steam curling upward, fragrant with thyme and bay. I ate slowly at the kitchen table, no phone beside me, no need to check for messages that wouldn't come. Outside, the lanterns would be coming down, the last of the guests saying their goodbyes. Inside, I was already moving forward, one quiet note and one careful step at a time. If Carla thought isolation would make me disappear, she was about to learn how visible a person can become when she decides it's time to be seen. The invitation came as an afterthought, literally. A folded card slid under my front door one Thursday morning, the paper slightly bent. The printed text read, "Spring Soiree, hosted at my daughter's house." The handwriting below, clearly Carla's, added casual help welcome. "See you at 5, help. Not join us, not celebrate with us, help." I considered throwing it away, but curiosity, and a small, stubborn streak? 1. If they wanted me there to serve, I'd at least see exactly how far they'd go. By 5 o'clock, the backyard was transformed. White tents draped with fairy lights, linen-covered tables, platters of food artfully arranged. Guests in pastel outfits mingled with champagne flutes in hand. The scent of grilled salmon and fresh basil floated on the warm air. Carla spotted me the moment I stepped through the side gate. Her smile was as polished as the silver serving trays. "Martha?" Perfect timing. "Could you take these appetizers around?" Before I could answer, she pressed a tray into my hands. The clink of glasses and hum of conversation swirled around me as I moved from group to group, offering bite-sized bruschetta. Some guests took them with polite nods, others barely glanced at me. A few mistook me for hired staff. Halfway through the circuit, I passed Lucas talking with a couple his age. Our eyes met for a second, enough for me to see the flicker of something, maybe apology, before Carla's voice cut in from behind. "Martha, when you're done there, the drinks table needs refreshing." Several heads turned. It wasn't the words, but the tone. Light, almost musical, yet pitched just loud enough to carry. A few guests smirked, one whispering something to another. I set my jaw and kept moving. At the drinks table, a tall man I didn't recognize handed me an empty glass. "Thanks, miss," he said, glancing past me for a refill. I poured sparkling water without correcting him. By the time I returned the tray to the kitchen, my back ached from standing. Carla was there, arranging a cheese board. She looked me up and down. Could you be a dear and wipe those outdoor tables? Some of the guests are sensitive about crumbs. Her phrasing made it sound like a favor, but the way she angled her body, blocking the counter, was a silent dismissal from the kitchen. Outside, the air had cooled. The fairy lights twinkled against the dusk, casting warm pools of light over the tables. I moved slowly, cloth in hand, listening. Laughter rippled from the far end of the yard. I caught fragments of conversation, vacations, real estate, someone's son getting into a top law school. As I wiped crumbs into my palm, I saw my daughter step onto the deck with Carla beside her. Carla gestured toward me, saying something that made my daughter's mouth tighten into an awkward smile. I didn't hear the words, but the meaning was clear from the way a few guests glanced my way with thinly veiled curiosity. I kept my face neutral, my hands steady on the cloth. If this was meant to humiliate me, it was working in the short term, but only in the way a paper cut stings before it heals into tougher skin. From the corner of my eye, I noticed the mayor's wife, an old acquaintance from my library days, watching me. When I finished wiping the table, she stepped closer. "Do they always have you running around like this?" she asked quietly. "Only on special occasions," I said, keeping my tone light. She gave me a long, considering look before walking away without another word. But I saw her glance back once, just before disappearing into the crowd. The sting of Carla's stage-managed kindness was real, but so was the knowledge I'd just been seen, not as she wanted me to be seen, but as I actually was. And that small shift in someone else's perception was worth more than any forced smile. By the time the dessert trays came out, my shoulders were tight from carrying plates and my cheeks ached from polite smiles. Carla, glowing under the canopy lights, moved between tables like a hostess in a magazine spread, always with a hand on someone's elbow, always in control. She found me near the drinks table. "Martha, could you help pass the Petits fours? They're delicate, so be careful." Her voice carried just enough to make sure half the guests heard. A few looked over, the corners of their mouths curving in quiet amusement. I took the tray without answering. The rows of pastel confections shimmered under the fairy lights, perfect in their symmetry. I began making my way through the crowd, offering them with the same composure I used to shelve rare books. Steady hands, no wasted motion. Near the deck steps, I spotted the mayor's wife again. She accepted a Petit four with a nod. "I always did admire your patience," she murmured. Her eyes held mine for a beat longer than necessary before she turned to the man beside her. That flicker of acknowledgement, small but genuine, slipped into my pocket like a coin. When the tray was empty, I returned to the kitchen. Carla was there refilling champagne glasses. "Perfect timing. Could you run these to table 3? She gestured to a silver bucket brimming with ice and bottles. I lifted it, feeling the chill seep into my palms, and stepped back outside. Table 3 sat near the back, half hidden by a trellis of climbing roses. As I approached, I recognized one of the guests, a local journalist who'd covered the library's expansion years ago. He remembered me. I could see it in the slight tilt of his head. "Didn't expect to see you working events," he said with a faint smile. "I'm just helping family," I replied, setting the bucket down. "But it's nice to see a familiar face." His eyes flicked toward the main crowd. Family can be complicated. I left him with that thought and made my way back toward the center of the yard. That's when I heard Carla's voice again, lilting and sweet. "Martha, could you bring out the cake?" The spotlight shifted instantly. Guests turned toward me, some curious, some entertained, as if I were part of the evening's performance. The cake, I knew, was the centerpiece, a 3-tier lemon confection that Carla had been bragging about all week. I carried it carefully from the kitchen, each step measured. Halfway across the yard, Carla's heel caught on a patch of uneven ground. She stumbled toward me, hand brushing my elbow. Not enough to knock me over, but enough to make the cake tilt dangerously. Gasps rippled through the crowd. But my grip held firm. I straightened the tiers before a single crumb shifted, then continued to the table as if nothing had happened. When I set it down, applause broke out, small at first, then spreading, led by the mayor's wife. "Grace under pressure," she said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. Carla's smile was brittle as she joined me at the table.
"Thank you, Martha,"
she said through her teeth. "You're welcome," I replied, meeting her gaze with the kind of steady calm that makes people wonder what you know. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of candlelight and soft music, but the dynamic had shifted. Guests who'd ignored me earlier now stopped to chat, recalling the cake incident with approving smiles. It was a tiny victory, but one I'd earned in front of her entire audience. When the last of the guests drifted away and the fairy lights dimmed, I slipped out quietly through the side gate. The air outside the yard was cooler, cleaner, as if I'd crossed an invisible line. Tonight, Carla had tried to make me invisible again. Instead, she'd handed me the first thread in the unraveling of her perfect tapestry, and I had no intention of letting go. 2 days after the soiree, the leftover hum of polite applause was still in my ears. Not because I enjoyed it, but because it had unsettled Carla. I'd seen the flash in her eyes, calculation giving way to caution. It was the first real shift in months. That morning, I sat at my kitchen table with a fresh cup of coffee and the lockbox open in front of me. The ledger lay beside it, its columns neat and precise, each line written in my own hand. Numbers had always been my anchor, proof that no matter how people spun words, facts stayed the same. Or at least they should. I flipped to the most recent entries. One deposit was missing. The figure neatly skipped over as if it had never existed. The date beside it, however, was burned into my memory. It was the week I'd asked my daughter to run a small errand at the bank for me, back when my knee was acting up. She'd assured me it was handled. A prickle crawled up my neck. I set the ledger aside and opened my desk drawer. Inside was a folder marked Household that had become my catch, all for statements, receipts, and old letters. I thumbed through until I found the bank's statements from that month. The deposit was there, but the account number was off by 2 digits. I knew enough to see what that meant. The money had gone somewhere else. The front door creaked and I froze listening, only the wind rattling the porch railing. Still, I slipped the statement into my cardigan pocket before standing. The bank was a short walk downtown, past rows of spring tulips and the smell of fresh bread from the corner bakery. Inside, the air was cool and faintly scented with copier toner. A young teller greeted me with a rehearsed smile. "I'd like to check on a transaction from last month," I said, sliding the statement across the counter. Her brow furrowed. "This account number isn't yours," she said after a glance. She looked back at me, polite but guarded. "Do you want me to pull the linked accounts?" "Yes, please." She disappeared into a back office. When she returned, she had a printout in her hand, which she placed carefully on the counter. The name beside the account number wasn't mine. It was Carla's. For a moment, the bank's fluorescent lights seemed too bright, the buzz in the air too loud. Carla had moved my money into an account under her name. It wasn't a mistake. It was a transfer. I thanked the teller, tucking the paper into my bag. On the walk home, my thoughts were a steady drumbeat. She'd crossed from petty cruelty into theft, and done it in a way she must have thought was invisible to me. Back in my kitchen, I spread the statement and the bank printout side by side. The evidence was plain, but I knew better than to rush. Storming over to confront her would only give her time to cover her tracks. Instead, I reached for my notepad again. The list I'd made after the backyard party was still folded inside the ledger. I added a new column: dates, documents, and people who might quietly confirm what I'd found. At the bottom, I wrote 2 words in neat block letters: "Keep quiet." This wasn't the moment to shout. It was the moment to listen, to gather, to make sure when I finally moved, she wouldn't see it coming. The kettle clicked off on the stove. I poured a fresh cup of tea, the steam curling upward in slow, deliberate spirals. She thought she'd taken something from me without consequence. She had no idea I'd just taken something from her, the element of surprise. The next morning I woke early, long before the sun warmed the curtains. Sleep had been thin, broken by flashes of Carla's face at the bank when she must have filled out those forms. Calm, confident, certain I'd never know. I boiled water for tea, then reached for the phone. "Louise? It's Martha." My voice was steady, but my pulse ticked in my throat. "I need a favor. The kind you don't tell anyone about." Louise didn't hesitate. "I'll put on coffee. Come by the shop before we open." Her vintage store sat on Main Street, tucked between a florist and a hardware shop. The bell over the door jingled as I stepped in, the air carrying the scent of cedar polish and old books. Mannequins in silk dresses stood like silent witnesses to every whispered conversation. Louise locked the front door behind me. "You've got that look," she said, leading me to the back office. "The same one you had when you found out the school board lost those grant funds." I pulled the folded bank printout from my bag and laid it on her desk. She moved my deposit into her account, quietly, without my permission. Louise leaned over reading, her brows knit together. That's not just bold. That's criminal. I can't just accuse her without more proof, I said. She's good at twisting things. If I go in half prepared, she'll spin it into a misunderstanding. Louise tapped her pen against the desk. What exactly do you need? I need every connection between my accounts and hers. Transfers, linked names, anything. And I need it to come from someone who knows how to look without raising alarms. Louise thought for a moment. My cousin's boy works in compliance at First State Bank. He owes me a favor. She picked up the phone, her tone light and friendly as she spoke to him. Nothing in her words would have tipped off an eavesdropper, but the way she nodded at me told me he understood. By the time I left, we had a plan. Louise's contact would pull what he could by the end of the week. In the meantime, she'd keep her ears open. Her shop was a crossroads for gossip disguised as casual chatter. That afternoon, I walked home the long way, past the park where Lucas used to feed the ducks with me. The benches were damp from a light morning rain, the air smelling faintly of wet grass and lilacs. For a moment, the ache of what I'd lost pressed heavy on my chest. Not just the money, but the ease with which they'd shut me out. Back at my kitchen table, I started a folder labeled Spring. Inside I placed the bank statement, the printout, and a copy of my ledger page for that week. I added a sheet of lined paper with notes in small, tight handwriting, dates of conversations, words Carla had used, who had been in the room. The habit came from years at the library. Track your sources, verify your facts, and keep your own copy. That evening, I received a text from Louise. We'll need 2 days. I deleted the message after reading it twice. The sky outside shifted from blue to deep rose, the edges of the clouds catching the last light. Somewhere down the street, laughter drifted from a neighbor's porch, a reminder of the gatherings I no longer attended. I wasn't lonely in that moment. I was focused. Carla thought she'd secured her advantage. What she didn't realize was that she'd given me a reason to stop reacting and start moving. Every file, every date, every small detail was a brick in the foundation I was quietly building. And when the walls were high enough, she wouldn't see me coming until the shadow fell across her. The clock on my nightstand showed 1:17 a.m. I had tried every trick I knew to fall asleep, but my mind refused to settle. It kept replaying the same picture: Carla at the bank, leaning on the counter with that polished smile she used when she thought she was in control. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of settling wood. Outside, rain tapped against the window in a steady, uneven rhythm. The lavender sachet in my dresser gave off a scent that should have been soothing, but it only reminded me of the scarf Lucas gave me for my last birthday. Carla had smirked at it and said, "Looks a little old-fashioned, doesn't it?" She had no idea it was the exact shade to match my favorite coat. I pushed back the covers and stepped into the living room. The floor cool beneath my bare feet. The street lamp outside sent a thin wash of amber light through the curtains, casting shadows over the coffee table where my ledger waited. I opened it to the page with the missing deposit and ran my fingers over the numbers. This was not just about money. It was about the message behind the act, the belief that I would not notice, that I was not worth protecting. Martin's voice came back to me from years earlier, clear as if he were in the room. "Always keep your own records, Mare. Not because you expect trouble, but because you'll be ready if it comes." He had never met Carla, but I was certain he would have recognized the type. I closed the ledger and walked into the kitchen. The kettle hissed softly as I set it on the burner, a sound I could control. Steam rose and curled against the window before vanishing into the dark outside. While the tea steeped, I took out the folder marked Spring from the drawer. I spread its contents across the table: the bank statement, the printout with her name, and the notes I had from Louise's call. Seeing them all together eased the knot in my chest. This was not chaos. It was the beginning of order. I pulled a clean sheet of paper toward me and drew 2 columns. One I labeled Known, the other Suspected. Under Known, I wrote transfer from my account to Carla's date and amount confirmed, witness bank teller, Louise's contact in compliance. Under Suspected, I added pattern of smaller withdrawals, possible joint account with my daughter, Carla influencing Lucas financially. By the time I set the pen down, the lists had grown, and so had the quiet resolve inside me. I knew I could not solve this in a single day, But I also knew I was no longer the passive figure they believed me to be. I would not wait to be pushed aside again. The rain outside slowed to a drizzle. The wet pavement caught the light from the street lamp, turning it into a faint glow. In that stillness, I felt the first outlines of a plan forming in my mind. Small steps, careful timing, and no moves that Carla could trace back to me until the moment I chose. I gathered the papers, slipped them back into the folder, and returned it to its place in the drawer. The clock now read 3:04 a.m. Sleep would come eventually. But when it did, I would rest knowing that I was no longer drifting in their current. I was steering. The morning after my sleepless night, the air in the house felt different. Charged, as if it knew I was no longer standing still. I dressed in a plain navy sweater and comfortable shoes, nothing that would draw attention. My goal was to move through the day unnoticed. The fewer eyes on me, the better. I walked to the corner cafe, the one with the cracked leather booths and the smell of fresh cinnamon rolls. It was a neutral place, somewhere I could think without the weight of my own walls pressing in. I took a seat near the back, ordered coffee, and unfolded my small notepad. The first task on my list was simple: test how far Carla's reach extended. I decided to call the community foundation where I had quietly donated for years. The director, a kind man named Peter, had always spoken freely with me. Today, his tone was clipped, polite but distant. When I asked about the scholarship fund I had set up, he paused before answering. I was told to direct all inquiries to your daughter now. She's listed as the main contact. I thanked him and hung up, my grip tightening on the pen. Carla wasn't just taking money. She was positioning herself as the voice of my legacy. That was more dangerous than any withdrawal. I needed more than bank records now. I needed proof of intent, something undeniable. Leaving the cafe, I crossed the street to the small print shop. The owner, Max, had been a friend since my library days. He greeted me with a grin and asked what I needed. Just a few document copies, I said, sliding the folder marked Spring across the counter. Max didn't ask questions, but his raised brow told me he understood these weren't ordinary papers. On the walk home, I spotted Lucas's old basketball hoop, still leaning against the side of my daughter's garage. For a moment, I hesitated on the sidewalk, wondering if he even remembered the afternoons we spent shooting hoops, laughing until the sun went down. Then I realized Carla had likely rewritten those memories for him too. Back inside, I filed the new copies in a second, hidden folder tucked behind the cookbooks in my kitchen cabinet. Keep was an old habit. Keep the important things where no one thinks to look. By late afternoon, Louise called. Her cousin's contact had sent over a discreet packet of information. I opened it slowly, scanning line by line. There were multiple transfers from my accounts over the past 6 months, some small, others in amounts that made my chest tighten. All led back to Carla, sometimes directly, sometimes funneled through an account shared with my daughter. I closed the packet and sat back in my chair. This was no longer suspicion. This was confirmation. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the kitchen floor. I made a pot of tea, the steam curling in the golden light, and let the facts settle in my mind. Carla thought she was the only one keeping score. She was wrong. From here on, every move I made would be deliberate. Every word, every smile, every nod at family gatherings would be part of the preparation. I would let her believe she still held the upper hand, until the day I decided she didn't. By the time the first frost hit that November, I had stopped waiting for anyone to hand my life back to me. If I wanted it, I would have to take it, quietly, piece by piece. The day began with the sound of mail sliding through the slot. I waited until the footsteps of the carrier faded before I picked it up. 3 envelopes were routine bills. The fourth, a thick packet from my insurance company, made my stomach tighten. I carried it to the kitchen, laid it flat, and sliced it open with the butter knife I kept in the drawer for such tasks. Inside, I found a notice that my secondary coverage had been switched to Authorized Representative. My daughter. I had never signed that authorization. I set the papers down and reached for my tea. The steam warmed my face, but my hands were cold. This was more than meddling now. This was the kind of slow, methodical takeover that left the victim nodding along until nothing belonged to them anymore. That morning, I called the insurance office, using the number printed at the bottom of the letter. A young woman named Natalie answered, cheerful but guarded. I explained the mix-up, and when she asked for verification, I gave it. Her voice hesitated over the keyboard clicks. It shows here the change was requested in person last month. By Carla. The name dropped into the silence between us like a stone. I thanked her, asked for a full activity log to be mailed directly to me, and hung up before my voice could betray anything. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the small potted fern by the window. Its leaves were drying at the tips, but the roots were still strong. All it needed was to be watered in time. I would be that kind of careful with myself from now on. After lunch, I went to see George Manning, the lawyer who had helped me in Martin close on our house decades ago. His office smelled faintly of old paper and cedar polish. "I need to review my power of attorney," I told him, sliding into the chair across from his desk. George adjusted his glasses, eyes sharp. "What's happened?" I handed him copies from my hidden folder. He read in silence, nodding slowly. "We can revoke and reissue your documents quietly. You'll need 2 witnesses you trust." I already had them in mind: Louise and my neighbor Harold, who had known me since Lucas was a toddler. From there, I stopped by the bank. I asked for statements going back 18 months, printed in duplicate. The teller glanced at the note in my file and said, "Of course, Mrs. Ellison." No sign of hesitation. Good. Carla's influence hadn't spread everywhere yet. Back home, I spread the day's papers across the dining table. I labeled each set with sticky notes: insurance, legal, banking, and tucked them into a new accordion folder. The act of sorting them felt like aligning puzzle pieces, revealing an image I'd only glimpsed before. As the sky darkened, I turned off the overhead light and let the room settle into shadows. I thought of Carla, probably planning her next move, never suspecting that I had already started mine. She believed she was weaving a net around me. What she didn't know was that I had found the edges, and I was quietly cutting through each strand. By the time I went to bed, the plan was set in motion. Over the next few weeks, I would reclaim my authority over every account, every policy, every signature they had tried to touch. I would do it without fanfare, without warning. And when they realized what had happened, it would be too late to undo it. The frost on the lawn outside glistened under the streetlight, each blade of grass standing firm despite the cold. I would be the same. 2 days after my visit to George and the bank, the plan began to take shape in a rhythm I could manage. Mornings were for small, deliberate actions, afternoons for waiting and watching. The first step was the bank's online access. I logged in using my tablet, changed every password, and added 2-step verification that would ping only my phone. Then I set up a new email address, one no one in the family knew, and linked it to all my accounts. If Carla tried to log in again, she would hit a locked door. Next, I called the insurance company and requested that all future correspondence be sent to a P.O. box I had just rented at the post office. The clerk there, a soft-spoken man with a white beard, didn't ask why I needed it. He slid the small brass key across the counter, and I tucked it into my pocket like a talisman. By midday, I moved on to the test. I called my daughter and left a message that sounded casual. "I'm thinking about taking a short trip down to Santa Fe next month, maybe to visit that old market. Haven't decided yet." I mentioned nothing about who I'd see or when. If Carla knew by the weekend, I would have my answer about where the leaks were. While I waited, I turned my attention to my will. The current version still left the bulk of my assets to my daughter, with Lucas named as a secondary beneficiary. That would change. George had drawn up a new draft, one that placed the scholarship fund for Lucas beyond anyone else's reach. It would be administered by the foundation directly, no authorized representatives. To meddle. In the evenings, I sat at the dining table with a cup of tea and the accordion folder open in front of me. I added small notes in the margins of documents, dates, names, subtle reminders of what each piece meant in the larger picture. It felt like building a fortress one brick at a time, knowing the enemy thought I was still unarmed. On the 3rd day, Louise came by with a grocery bag. Hidden under the lettuce and apples was a flash drive. "Cousin's contact pulled some public filings," she said. Inside were property records showing that the LLC from Carla's ownership transfer papers had been created just weeks before she first asked me to sign anything. Its registered address matched one of Carla's old business ventures. That night, as rain began to fall again, I sat in my living room and read through the filings. The pattern was clear. Carla was laying the groundwork to absorb my assets under the cover of a legitimate company. But now I had evidence she couldn't explain away. The phone rang just after 9. I almost didn't answer, but the caller ID flashed Lucas's name. His voice was low, tense. "Grandma, I think something's going on. Carla's been making calls. She asked me if you'd been to the bank lately. I didn't tell her anything, but..." The line went quiet for a moment. as if he were deciding whether to say more. She's angry, Grandma. I don't know what she found, but she's not happy. When we hung up, I stayed in the darkened room, the rain tapping against the window. It was the confirmation I'd been waiting for. My test had worked. Carla's reach depended on people talking, and if she was angry, it meant she was starting to feel the shift. The next phase would require precision. I couldn't push too hard yet, but I also couldn't let her regain her footing. She thought she was tightening the noose. In truth, I was drawing her closer to the moment I would cut the rope entirely. Outside, the rain picked up, steady and cold. I let it fill the silence, a reminder that storms could wash things clean if you stood through them long enough. The morning of the one-day cutoff began like any other, at least, that's what I wanted them to believe. I brewed coffee, the rich scent curling through the kitchen, and buttered a slice of toast I had no intention of eating. My mind was elsewhere, ticking through the list I had memorized over the past week. Every step had to land perfectly in order, no hesitation. By 8 o'clock, I was dressed in my gray wool coat and flat leather shoes, the ones that didn't squeak on tile floors. I left through the side door, avoiding the front where Carla might spot me from her window across the street. The air was sharp with winter, each breath a small cloud. My first stop was the bank. The manager, Mr. Lyons, greeted me with a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. I slid my folder across the desk. "These accounts," I said, tapping the first page, "need to be moved to single holder status. Effective immediately." He glanced at the paperwork. "Revocations signed and notarized," and nodded. "It'll take effect within the hour." Good. That meant any attempted withdrawals would bounce before lunch. From there, I walked 2 blocks to the notary office. In my bag were fresh documents. George had prepared a new power of attorney, a revised will, and an updated trust deed. Louise and Harold met me there, their signatures steady despite the weight of what they were witnessing. "You sure about this?" Harold asked quietly. "Positive?" I said. "This is the only way to keep what's mine and what's meant for Lucas." By noon, the final step was in motion. I called the insurance company from a pay phone at the bus station, an old habit Martin had taught me when privacy mattered. Terminate all authorized representatives except the primary account holder. I told Natalie, the same clerk from before. She confirmed the change, her tone sharper now. "Mom, this will restrict family members from making decisions on your behalf." I smiled to myself. That's exactly the point. The bus ride home gave me time to think about what came next. Carla would find out soon, probably by late afternoon, that her access was gone. She would call, maybe show up, maybe send my daughter first. It didn't matter. Every legal thread she had been pulling was now severed. When I stepped off the bus, the clouds hung low and heavy, as if the sky itself was bracing for something. I walked the last block to my house, the folder tucked under my arm, the keys cold in my pocket. Inside, I set the folder on the table and poured a fresh cup of coffee. The house was silent except for the slow tick of the clock on the wall. Each second felt deliberate, like the pause before a curtain rises. The day wasn't over yet, but my side of the battle had just begun. It didn't take long. By 3 o'clock, the phone began to ring. First once, then again, each time longer, more insistent. I let the answering machine pick up. Carla's voice came through, sharp and cold. "Call me back." No attempt at charm. Just the demand of someone who'd just discovered a locked door where there used to be a wide open gate. 10 minutes later, the doorbell rang. I didn't move from my chair in the kitchen. Through the lace curtain, I saw my daughter on the porch, shifting from foot to foot. She knocked, called my name, tried the handle. I sipped my coffee, let the warmth anchor me. This wasn't about shutting them out. It was about showing them that the rules had changed. The knocking stopped. Then came the sound of hurried steps and a car door slamming. I thought maybe they'd left, but a few minutes later, the phone rang again. This time I picked up. "What did you do?" Carla's voice was low, almost a hiss. "The bank says I'm not on the account. The insurance says I can't speak for you anymore. Do you have any idea how dangerous this is?" "Dangerous for who?" I asked, keeping my tone even. "For everyone," she snapped. "We've been managing things for you, making sure you're taken care of." "I'm capable of taking care of myself," I cut in. "Always have been." There was a pause. I could hear her breathing hard. "I'm coming over. We're going to talk about this face to face." "I'll be here," I said, and hung up. I stood at the window, watching the street. The sky had darkened, clouds hanging low, threatening snow. I thought of Martin, how he used to say a storm was only as bad as the shelter you had. Today, my shelter wasn't walls and a roof. It was every step I'd taken in the last week to seal off my life from their reach. Half an hour later, her car pulled up. She got out fast, slamming the door, her coat flaring behind her. My daughter followed, head down, hands jammed into her pockets. Carla's eyes were fixed on my front door like it was a battlefield gate. I stayed where I was, behind the door, letting her call my name, knock again. The rhythm of it was almost frantic. Finally, she called out, her voice loud enough to carry down the street. "You can't just cut us out. We deserve to know what's going on with your money. Your future." I opened the door just enough to meet her eyes. My future is mine. And as of today, so is my present. Her mouth opened, but no words came. For the first time, she looked unsure. The wind picked up, rattling the bare branches above us. She squared her shoulders. "This isn't over. I'll be back tonight, and you'd better be ready to explain yourself." I closed the door slowly, the latch clicking into place. My pulse was steady, my hands warm around the coffee mug I'd left on the table. Tonight, then, let her come. By the time darkness settled, the wind had sharpened to a steady howl against the windows. I kept the lights low, letting the house feel calm, as if it were any other winter evening. But inside, every sense was tuned to the sound of tires on gravel, a door slamming, the cadence of footsteps on my porch. At 7 sharp they came. Carla entered first without waiting for an invitation. My daughter followed, her eyes darting between us. Carla's coat was unbuttoned, the cold still clinging to her hair and the edges of her scarf. She didn't sit. Instead, she planted herself across from me at the dining table. "Let's skip the pleasantries," she said. "You've made some reckless changes, and you need to reverse them before it's too late." I leaned back slightly, the folder of documents resting on the table between us. "Too late for who?" My voice was calm, almost quiet. "For you, or for me?" Carla's jaw tightened. "Do you think you can handle all of this alone? The accounts, the insurance, the property?"
I already am,
I said, sliding the folder toward her. "And since you seem to enjoy paperwork, I thought you'd appreciate seeing the latest updates." She hesitated, then opened it. Inside was a neat stack, the revoked power of attorney, the new will, the trust deed transferring the scholarship fund to Lucas's name, and the property records Louise had uncovered, the ones showing her LLC's sudden creation and matching address. Her eyes scanned the pages, then froze. "Where did you get this?" "Public record," I said. "Funny how things hide in plain sight if you know where to look." My daughter's face paled. "Carla, is that—" "Don't—" Carla snapped, but the edge in her voice was thinner now. I let the silence stretch. The only sound was the faint ticking of the clock and the wind rattling the eaves. "Finally," I spoke. "You've been planning to take what isn't yours. You counted on me being too tired, too distracted, too old to notice." She shoved the folder back toward me. "You don't understand how business works." "I understand exactly how betrayal works," I said, "and how to end it." I stood, sliding the folder under my arm. "As of this afternoon, you have no legal standing in my affairs. If you try to push further, you'll be answering to more than just me." For a moment, she looked as if she might argue, but instead, she glanced at my daughter. "We're leaving." They walked to the door in silence. Carla paused on the threshold, her breath visible in the cold air. "You'll regret this?" she said, not meeting my eyes. I closed the door behind them, locking it with a steady hand. The house felt warmer somehow, as if it had exhaled with me. On the table, my coffee had gone cold, but I didn't mind. Tonight, the storm had broken, and I was still standing. The morning after the storm was unnervingly quiet. No phone calls, no knocks at the door. The street outside was lined with fresh snow, each branch holding its own small crown of white. It was the kind of silence I used to treasure. Now, it felt like the pause between heartbeats, still, but charged. I made coffee and stood by the window, watching the light shift across the street. Carla's car was gone. My daughter's too. The absence was almost as loud as their presence had been yesterday. By mid-morning, a knock did come, gentle, almost hesitant. When I opened the door, Lucas stood there, bundled in a thick parka, snow dusting his hair.
Can I come in?
He asked. His voice was quiet, but there was no edge to it. We sat at the kitchen table, steam curling from our mugs. He looked down into his coffee before speaking. "I saw what happened last night. I didn't know about any of it. Not the papers, not what Carla's been doing." I studied his face. He had his mother's eyes, but the way he held my gaze reminded me of Martin. Sometimes, I said slowly, we don't see the truth until it steps into the light, and sometimes we choose not to see it because it's easier. Lucas nodded, jaw tight. I want to make it right. I don't know how yet, but I'm on your side, Grandma. The words settled in my chest like a warm ember. For all the walls I'd had to build, there were still bridges worth crossing. We spent the next hour in a kind of easy conversation we hadn't shared in years. About his classes, the winter market in town, the way the snow seemed to change the sound of the world. Every so often, a shadow would cross his face, as if he were remembering something he wished he could undo. After he left, I wrapped myself in my wool shawl and sat in the living room, letting the quiet seep back in. It didn't feel threatening anymore. It felt open. That afternoon, I went through the house with a deliberate pace, room by room, taking stock of what was mine. Not just the furniture and photos, but the small things that carried weight. The quilt Martin's mother had made, folded neatly in the sitter chest, the chipped blue mug I reached for every morning, the scent of lavender from the drawer where I kept my scarves. Everything was still here. More importantly, I was still here. Near dusk, the phone rang. My daughter's number flashed on the screen. I let it go to voicemail. Her voice was measured, almost formal. Mom, we need some space right now. Carla's upset. I'm upset. Maybe we can talk later. I didn't delete the message, but I didn't return it either. Space was exactly what we needed. Only for once, it was on my terms. As the sun dipped below the snow-covered rooftops, I lit a single lamp in the corner of the room. The light was warm, steady, unhurried. I thought about how much of my life had been spent bending to keep the peace, to avoid the fracture. Now the fracture was already there, and I was beginning to see that through the cracks, light could get in. The next morning, the quiet felt different, less like a pause, more like a choice. I took my coffee to the sunroom, where the light spilled across the floor in pale gold strips. Outside, the snow had begun to melt along the edges of the walk, revealing patches of dark stone. It felt like the world was loosening its grip. Around mid-morning, Louise called. Well, she asked, skipping any greeting.
How did it go? It's done,
I said. The papers are signed, the accounts are sealed, and they know it. I could almost hear her smile. Good. That means you can stop looking over your shoulder. Not entirely? I said. They'll be back in some form, but now I can meet them on even ground. We decided to meet at her shop that afternoon. When I walked in, the bell over the door chimed, and the familiar scent of cedar and old books wrapped around me. Louise was at the counter, sorting through a box of antique brooches. She held one up, a silver filigree with a deep blue stone. This belonged to a woman who didn't take nonsense from anyone, she said, pressing it into my hand. Thought you might like to wear it? It was heavier than it looked, cool against my palm. I'll take it, I said, fastening it to my coat before we stepped outside for a walk. We wandered down Main Street, past the bakery with its warm yeasty air and the post office where Martin used to stop for his morning chat. People greeted us, some with small talk, others with the kind of nod that carries respect. It struck me how different it felt to move through town without the invisible weight of their control pressing on my shoulders. Back home, I cleared the dining table and laid out the last of my documents in careful rows. Not because I needed to check them again. I knew every line by heart, but because I wanted to see the whole picture. Each page was a boundary drawn, a door closed to those who thought they could take without asking. As I worked, I thought about Lucas. His visit yesterday had left a mark. Maybe the fracture in our family could be repaired someday. But if it wasn't, I'd still be standing. I'd learned too much about the cost of silence to give it away again. Near sunset, I lit the fire in the living room and settled into the armchair with a blanket over my knees. The house felt steady, almost like it was breathing with me. On the mantel, I placed the silver brooch in a small dish where the firelight caught the blue stone and made it glow. If Carla or my daughter came back, they'd find a woman who wasn't waiting for permission to hold her ground. And if they didn't come back, well, I'd already claimed something more important than reconciliation. I had reclaimed my life. The lake house was smaller than my old home, but the air felt lighter here. I arrived in early spring, the ice still clinging to the far edges of the water. The first night I slept with the window cracked open, listening to the soft lap of waves against the shore. It was the kind of sound that didn't ask anything of you, just existed, steady and calm. Each morning, I walked the narrow path from the porch down to the dock. The boards were weathered but solid under my feet. A few ducks had already returned, cutting smooth trails across the glassy surface. I breathed in the sharp scent of pine and damp earth, letting it replace the sterile smell of closed rooms and tense conversations. By the third day, I'd unpacked most of the boxes. The essentials came first: my cedar chest, with the quilt inside, the chipped blue mug, and the stack of letters Martin had written during our first years together. They sat in a neat pile on the small desk by the window, the sunlight turning their edges gold. On the fourth afternoon, Lucas arrived. His old truck crunched along the gravel drive, and when he stepped out, he looked younger than I'd seen him in years. "It's beautiful here," he said, glancing toward the water. He carried a paper bag from the bakery, still warm rolls, and a jar of honey. We sat on the porch with mugs of tea, watching the light shift over the lake. "I wanted to tell you something in person," he began. "I applied for that scholarship you set up. Not for me, for a kid in my program. He got it?" His smile was quiet but proud. "You're already making a difference." The words settled over me like the sun on my shoulders. For months, my world had been narrowed to defense, to holding the line against people I loved but couldn't trust. Now, here was proof that something I'd fought to protect was moving forward into someone else's future. As the afternoon waned, we walked down to the dock. The wind was cool, tugging gently at my shawl. Lucas stood beside me, hands in his pockets. "Do you think you'll ever go back?" he asked. I looked out over the water, where the last of the ice was breaking apart.
I think, I said slowly.
"That I'm exactly where I need to be, and maybe someday, they'll see that too." The lake was quiet but alive. Reminder that even after the hardest winter, the thaw always comes. That evening, the lake turned to silver under the rising moon. Lucas stayed for dinner, simple roasted vegetables and bread still warm from the bakery. We ate by the fire, the flames crackling in the hearth, casting shadows that danced across the walls. It was the first time in a long while that I felt no need to glance over my shoulder, no itch in the back of my mind warning me of an incoming blow. After we cleared the dishes, we settled back into our chairs. Lucas leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You know," he said, "you could turn this place into more than just a home, a space for others, workshops, retreats, a place to breathe." I smiled at the thought. That's not far from what I've been thinking. A library, maybe. Somewhere people can come to read, to talk, to feel welcome. My fingers traced the rim of my mug. "And a fund for kids like the one in your program. If I've learned anything, it's that a door left open can change a life." Lucas nodded, the firelight catching the warmth in his expression. "I want to help. Not because I feel guilty, though I do, but because I believe in what you're building." The room fell into a comfortable quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, and somewhere across the lake, a loon called, its voice carrying low and clear. I thought of all the nights I'd spent in silence before, silence heavy with exclusion, with the sense of being pushed aside. This was different. This was peace. Before he left, Lucas hugged me tightly. "I'm proud of you," he said softly. "You didn't just protect yourself. You built something better." When his truck's taillights disappeared into the dark, I stood on the porch, pulling my shawl tighter against the chill. The lake lay still, the stars reflected on its surface like scattered coins. I realized then that my story, the one I thought others had the power to erase, was firmly in my hands. I'd written the ending I needed, not the one they tried to give me. And now, there was space for new beginnings. Inside, I added another log to the fire and sat down at the small desk. With a steady hand, I began to write. Plans, ideas, names. My legacy was no longer a distant thought. It was here alive, taking shape with every line. Some winters end suddenly. Mine had melted slowly, but it left the ground richer, and I was ready to plant,